I'd like to invite to the stage Mate Penks, founder and CEO of Loft, and Lucas Vargas, CEO at Zap Viva Real. Just as a start, we are seeing most individuals already looking for homes online. Home buyers are being helped by new technologies such as artificial intelligence for virtual tour, real-time chatbots, big data, virtual reality, try before you buy model, blockchain technology to buy real estate. Which of these technologies are already being used in Brazil, and which others you think we should see soon?
So thanks, Fábio, for the invitation. It's a very interesting question because it reminds me of a quote from Dan Ariely, who's a professor and writes about behavior economics. And it's from a few years ago when people asked him about big data. His response was, well, big data is like teenage sex. Everyone talks about it. No one really knows how to do it. Everyone thinks everyone else is doing it, but in the end, everyone claims they're doing it. And of course, when you think of big data, as of today, lots has changed. But you mentioned multiple technologies and functionalities. And in real estate today, you can already see all of them being applied, all of them being used by users, but still in the very infant stages. When we talk about blockchain in Brazil, for example, yes, we can see a few startups, we can see a few transactions happening with bitcoins, but it's still in very early days. Of course, when you think of AI, virtual reality, we already see brokerage firms, home builders, tech startups already offering a broad range of solutions and services, but there's still a need for infrastructure to evolve for us to really be able to spread those technologies across the multiple steps of the consumer journey. So yes, there's lots that has been done, and maybe we can explore this later, but I would say it's still very early in this journey.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Fábio, and BTG, I guess, as a whole. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I'd completely agree with Lucas. I think this actually applies worldwide, but certainly in Brazil, where you're talking about a population that, even though is very far ahead of the curve in many ways in tech adoption, at the end of the day, the core kind of value proposition is what counts. So, if we take virtual reality, for example, as one of the hyped technologies out there that Fábio mentioned on his list, it's something that we've at Loft tested, other companies have tested, and time and again, what we see is that people like it. It's a cool gimmick to get people excited, but at the end of the day, people want to see real product, real value. In our specific case, people might put those goggles on, and at the end of the day, they'll be like, okay, but show me the real product. Show me the physical apartment. Show me what it's going to look like once it's done. So using technology as an enabler of the process, so making the process of transacting real estate or making the process of discovering real estate less frictionful, I think in many ways supersedes any of these buzzwords, any of these kind of more frontier tools that people love to talk about, but in practice, when it comes to the consumer journey, doesn't really drive much conversion yet. So it's one of those things that I think all of us have to be focused on. I think that to be ahead of the curve years from now, we have to start working on these tools and technologies today. But I think that anywhere globally, but especially in Brazil, where consumer needs sit at the more basic level than they do in many places here in the US. I think you're talking about kind of focusing on the core value prop first.
Also, I'd like to explore a little bit about the iBuyer model. Can you share with us more details about this model, the main advantages, disadvantages, and if you consider an iBuyer or a full-service real estate company?
I think iBuyer is also one of those polemic buzzwords that has been thrown around a lot in recent years, and certainly here in the U.S. there's a fairly competitive playing field of so-called pure play iBuyers, as well as iBuyers that started as marketplace businesses or as real estate classifieds businesses and have moved into iBuying. I think at the end of the day, iBuying or instant buying, for those that haven't heard of this, it's essentially a way of using technology, using a platform to give an instant offer, usually based upon data. So you'll use your data set to make a quick decision on what a certain property might be worth, and then pay upfront cash. Which to me, is just, again, a way to tech enable one of the oldest businesses in the world. Flipping homes here in the US or flipping homes anywhere around the world is one of the oldest industries, one of the oldest trades out there. And there's always been people willing to pay upfront for a certain convenience discount or a certain liquidity discount. So this buzzword of iBuying is just really kind of a tech-enabled and accelerated version of a business or trade that's already been out there. And as a consequence, there's a certain population out there of folks, whether it's in the US or in Brazil, that are willing to take a discount on the price that they're willing to sell for in the exchange for convenience. Now, we have a large component to our business at Loft that pays upfront liquidity to the sellers, but there's also many other facets to the value proposition, both to the seller and to the buyer, that feed into this. So I think that I think both of us here, certainly on stage, and many other companies will increasingly have iBuyer-ish components to their businesses. But I think that it's far from being kind of a silver bullet, as Joel said earlier here on stage. The iBuying sort of as a concept in and of itself is not really a silver bullet. It's something that, if well used, can be a powerful part of one's value proposition.
Yeah. So in our case, Zap was established following the merger of Zap Imóveis and Viva, the two leading real estate classifieds in Brazil. So that's the core business. That has been how we started. But even after that merger, with a very clear purpose of simplifying the consumer journey in real estate in Brazil, we are still very far from that goal. That's the reality, right? Anyone who buys, sells, or rents real estate in Brazil has a really bad experience. We know that. We have recently started operating the iBuyer business unit internally, and I can give just one example. The first property that we bought was in a given building, and there were about 80 listings in that building, and we know there are lots of duplicates, old information. Everyone knows about that. And out of those 80, we called each one of them. And there were about 6 or 7 unique properties available. So imagine if you were a buyer and you have to go through all of those 80 listings. It's a really hard, bad experience. Everyone knows that. So, and real estate, residential real estate is probably the largest asset class in Brazil where trade is dominated by amateurs, right? If you think of stock, currency, or whatever, trade, and we know, is much more professionalized. And so we have that goal of improving and really transforming the real estate sales and marketing experience. And the iBuyer is just one more piece of this big puzzle. In our case, we see the iBuyer, given that we have a functional business based on recurring revenue and that keeps growing and is profitable, the iBuyer is basically a market maker for real estate. That's how we see it. So we don't see it as a business unit that we should be thinking of increasing margin on each transaction. Rather, we want to increase the number of transactions. We want to increase liquidity, and after that, send lots of benefits to the marketplace. When I was explaining here our first experience buying properties, it just gives us so much information and data that helps us go back to the marketplace and organize the inventory and improve the experience, and that generates loyalty from consumers. And we are essentially a business that is driven by audience, and so it just increases the value of the ecosystem. So that's it. We are using the iBuyer more as an enabler rather than a business itself.
Interesting. And what is the size of this opportunity for your business? How do you see the size of the addressable market in Brazil?
So I mean, real estate, as an asset class, is obviously the largest asset class out there globally. It's sort of a, depending on the measures or the metrics you look at, it's sort of a $2 to $3 trillion industry. And residential real estate, as a subcategory of that is the largest by far. And as Lucas correctly mentioned, in Brazil, this is an asset class that turns a lot less than it does in developed markets. And fundamentally, a lot of the reasons for that are both liquidity and a lack of transparency. I think that one of the things that we fundamentally believe in and agree on here is that through the use of data and through the use of a smoother transactional experience, you should be able to increase liquidity. And certainly if you look at countries that evolved from developed markets from emerging markets to developed markets, you clearly see this uptake or this kind of relatively exponential curve in an increase in liquidity and transactions as the market becomes more trusted, as the market becomes more transparent. So I think I see this opportunity as massive, whether it's in the big urban centers, which is what Loft is focused on, where essentially we launched in São Paulo. We're looking at our business very much from the lens of the Latin American megacity. We're making our model, which is a fairly vertically integrated model, different from Zap. We're very focused on dense urban areas. But even if you look beyond dense urban areas, there is a big lack of trust. There is a big lack of liquidity. So I think, if that could just be dialed up incrementally, you're talking about massive absolute changes in the market. And again, even compared to markets like Mexico, Brazil is lagging behind, and not to mention Europe or the US. So I'm fairly confident that through the use of technology and capital, we're all going to be able to inch up the liquidity in the market, and that's ultimately going to benefit everyone here.
Yeah, so not much to add. In our case, given that we have been operating in this, well, Zap was founded back in 2000. Viva was founded 10 years ago. So different times and same purpose, but still very different business and ambitions. But when we look internationally as references, we can see how much value has been extracted from organizing the information, providing convenience to those who are buying, selling, and renting, and that has been done ultimately by technology, as Mate said, and capital. So there's not much to add to what Mate said, but yeah, it's huge, a huge asset class. Still, lots of inefficiencies. When we look at the share of the commission pool that is in Brazil earned by real estate classifieds or marketing and sales startups, it's still a fraction of what other players in countries like Germany, UK, Australia, and other consolidated markets are able to capture. So there's still a lot to be done and to be captured in Brazil.
I agree. The opportunities are huge. At the same time, we see hundreds of PropTechs, ConstruTechs already operating in Brazil. I heard about over 500. I don't know if you have a similar figure in mind, but it seems like the the disruptions in the real estate business are happening at a slower pace compared to other industries. Do you agree, and why?
So the cycles in real estate are longer, and that, in my understanding, is that's the main reason why innovation takes longer to kick in. That's one thing. And the second is the fact that from an ecosystem perspective, there are multiple actors, institutions, and individuals involved in this journey, right? So if you think of the purchase journey, we are all intermediaries here, right? We're all in between buyers and sellers. And it's not only us. There are banks, brokerage firms, agents, mortgage brokers, all sorts of local institutions and city hall, etc., that are involved in the journey that really complicates the life of those who are buying or selling. Over 50%, so we have a mortgage broker, we used to have that in the past, we have now again, over 50% of buyers who get a quote from a bank trying to buy a mortgage, over 50% is declined by the bank. So imagine, it's after years, it's over 2 years, the standard buying journey. After 2 years of looking all of the stressful experience, you get to the final step, which is just getting a mortgage, and then over 50% of those people are declined. So it's really long, and that's the complexity, and just the fact that you have multiple players involved makes everything harder.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the only thing I would add, I guess, is that it is a complex ecosystem with a lot of different stakeholders. It's a complex transaction, and it's a high-value transaction. So it's not only relatively low in frequency, but currently also, given its high in value, it's a very important transaction for the end consumer, whether it's the buyer or the seller, to ultimately trust technology. So I think that when you look at a lot of the companies that have been built in this ecosystem, a lot of these companies have been niche companies, going after a very specific piece of the value chain and trying to marginally improve that piece of the value chain. But very few companies have been able to summon the talent or summon the capital that's necessary to integrate a bigger piece of the value chain and ultimately offer more and more of a one-stop solution. So I think as we compare prop tech to other large categories, whether it's fintech or e-commerce, those experiences are much more one-stop shop experiences today than any experience in real estate. And I think that whether it's Loft or Zap, I think we're all kind of fighting to increase the total addressable market by making it more liquid, but we're also all trying to take bigger and bigger chunks of the value chain to include it into our single transactional experience, because that's ultimately, I think, what will create the step change in getting more consumers on board and kind of getting the flywheel effect spinning for these companies. I think that, frankly, if we just look at a lot of these businesses that have been started over the last 5 to 10 years, they ended up being subscale with respect to where you have to be to really capture the consumer's attention. And again, also considering the fact that you're paying a very high customer acquisition cost. Customers are doing this very rarely, on average 5 to 10 years, depending on the city and neighborhoods you look at. So it's a low frequency transaction, and it's hard to cross-sell products. So I think we probably shouldn't use the past as reference for the future. I don't know if we're quite at a tipping point yet where large prop tech companies will be created in Brazil. I certainly believe we do. I certainly do think that we've gotten to this critical mass, both around capital and talent, that large category-defining prop tech companies are being built in Brazil. But I think it's I think it's been tough, and I think it has been changing rapidly. Though I think if you look at just the last parenthesis, if you look at fintech before 2010, 2011, there were already dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of companies going after fintech opportunities. But then all of a sudden, Nubank, Stone, PagSeguro were all born within a period of a couple of years and are now worth anywhere between $5 to $15 billion, and that all happened in a very short period of time. So I think that if you look at a lot of what happened back then in fintech, I see a lot of the same things happening in proptech today in Latin America.
Yeah, I remember in 2014, actually 15, one of our investors called us asking our opinion to get feedback about Nubank because they were raising at 500 pre, and they thought it was expensive, so they passed. Back in 2014, 15. So 4 years ago, right? Things change really fast.
Yes, I mean, I think that, again, we probably shouldn't deviate too far from off topic, but I think if you look at valuations, and if you look at Brazil or Latin America on a comparative basis versus in India or China or any other market that has been sort of catching up rapidly in the technology sector with the U.S., these curves are very exponential. Like China had less than a dozen unicorns in 2003, 2004, and then today we're talking about certainly more than 100, probably several hundred, and I think that there's a lot of these leading indicators for a lot of these nations and for specific sectors. So again, I think that it's really hard to apply the past as a leading indicator for the future.
Okay, so still in this subject, we are seeing more and more funding for tech companies in Brazil is definitely much more easily accessible across all tech segments. It's impressive how we see more angel investors, even family offices. We are seeing big private equity firms interested in the tech opportunities, as well as VC and growth funds in the US. We've been in touch with many of them, and it's impressive how they have interest, they have money to invest here in Brazil, sorry. But at the same time, many of these new entrants in Brazil, in this niche in Brazil, they are not very familiar with some specificities of the Brazilian market or best metrics, in some cases even valuation. So I'd like to hear from you if you think some companies with rich valuation but not so great unit economics, or even though they have great investment cases, fantastic people, what's the reason behind this? Can you share your thought about this?
Yes, I guess I'm partially wearing my investor hat here. After I started and sold my last company, which was an e-commerce company, I moved to Brazil 8 years ago, built and sold that company, and then I helped co-found Canary, which is one of the leading early stage investment firms in Brazil. And I'd say that certainly what you described right now, Fábio, applies universally across the globe. I think that the same skepticism or the same cynicism about metrics and valuations could be applied at different points in the cycle, whether it's in Silicon Valley or in China or anywhere around the world, really. I mean, VCs are making a bet on the future, and oftentimes based off of very limited information, and oftentimes certainly unproven models. So the earlier you're investing, the more risk you're running, and the later stage you're investing, the more solid the metrics should be. So I think that that in of itself doesn't really bother me or make me uncomfortable. I think that one of the things that changed a lot in Brazil, and I think until recently has fed a lot of the skepticism, is that you didn't necessarily have amazing teams or very well-prepared teams going after these opportunities. So I think that one of the things that certainly has changed Lucas and I, and a lot of our cohort, like the ecosystem was very small 5, 7, 8 years ago, and there were just too many people going out there and starting companies without necessarily having the experience or having the available talent pool to execute on these opportunities. And I think that has gotten to a critical tipping point over the last 1 to 2 years. We're seeing that strongly in the data at Canary, and I think a lot of the VC funds, certainly some of our friends that will be speaking on stage after us, they've been seeing a lot of these trends happening over the last 1 to 2 years, and I'd say that certainly you can always argue about valuation. I think price consensus is never really there. I think taking one of the most obvious examples, but I think every single venture round of Facebook, there was perfect consensus on the business. Everyone agreed that it was a great business, maybe except for the very first round. But all the subsequent rounds, all VCs thought it was a great company. There just wasn't consensus on price. So I think in Brazil, it's kind of the same thing. You're having more and more consensus around potential future winners in categories, but valuations are creeping up. So you're talking about valuations that are richer versus the traction that these companies are driving today. But again, critically, the gap is being filled by the execution and the talent that these companies are bringing to the table.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of timing, right? As Matheus said, this has happened everywhere in the world, and I think that a few years ago we still lacked one very important piece in this game, which was the existence of successful entrepreneurs who would be the angel investors of the new startups. Right? Everywhere in the world it was similar. If you go today to the United States or to China, you have a lot of availability of capital from angel investors, from former entrepreneurs or executives who have already exited. And in Brazil, there's still not this big number of tech exits to create this pool of angel investors who really understand the industry, the ecosystem, and the challenges. So maybe that addresses part of your question. Do people really understand? Well, the reality is that right now, so it has changed a bit, but still, most of the angel investors, most of the associations, angel associations, are not composed. The majority of those associations are not former entrepreneurs, right, or tech entrepreneurs. So, but this changes. It evolves. So it's just a matter of timing, and it all changes. Back when 8 years ago, when we started initially working with tech, there was nothing, right? It was really hard. Like joining a startup back in 2011. It was crazy, right? So it was very hard for you to attract talent, for you to get the industry to connect to you, for you to do business. Everything was harder. So things have evolved. Today it's cool. People like to work at our industry. So things change. So it's just a matter of timing.
Yeah, thanks. Well, you are both very successful entrepreneurs in Brazil and also executives in the tech segment, and I think a new generation of successful executives and entrepreneurs, I would say. Can you share the main challenges to operate in Brazil, especially for an entrepreneur? Which were the main challenges you had, and would you mention?
I guess it's a long list, so I have to see where to start. And certainly the challenges have shifted over time. Some of them continue to be constant, but certainly there's been a big shift. I'd say that 8 years ago, as Lucas said, when sort of the large first wave of entrepreneurs started building technology companies in Brazil, and certainly also a lot of the foreigners that were attracted to the Brazilian market came. funding in and itself was a big challenge. Attracting talent was a big challenge. Obviously, navigating a lot of the bureaucracy and regulatory environment was a challenge. And some of that regulatory piece continues to be an issue. But I think the same way that tech is now sexier on the talent side, it's also certainly more front and center for the regulator. It's more front and center in Brasilia. So you're getting a lot more visibility as a tech company, and certainly it's that enables the process of executing and scaling faster. So I'd say that net it's certainly easier to operate today. You can execute faster. You can summon both capital and talent faster. The kind of addressable talent pool has increased significantly. Before, as Lucas said, it was really just the crazies that would want to work for you, or certainly it was a hard sell to get anyone of a reputable background with a good education to join a tech startup. They really had wanted to do it because certainly everything worked against it. I remember a lot of our early employees having to go as far as to convince their parents that that they weren't sort of getting into certain financial ruin by joining an early stage company. So it's that's certainly involved a lot. And I think that a lot of the challenges today are becoming challenges that are more similar to the challenges you're facing here in the Valley or that you're facing in more mature tech ecosystems. So you're starting to actually have more competition for talent because you're starting to have larger at scale technology companies in Brazil. So nowadays, when anybody's looking to leave a bank or looking to graduate from a top university, they have a choice of 10, 15 relatively mature technology companies that they can go to. So I think that talent challenge has kind of flipped on its head. And it's become a lot about culture and employer branding and things that back in the day very few people used to worry about. Nowadays, again, is kind of front and center, making sure that you have a very well-defined company culture, and people want to work for companies that ultimately have a value prop that they can identify with. So it's really not just about comp anymore. I think a lot of these soft factors nowadays come into play. I think that makes the environment to operate and scale in more challenging, more difficult, because you are moving at hyper speed. You're blitz scaling your company. You're growing very fast, and you're having to do lots of course corrections on culture, course corrections on the composition of your management team. You're really having to think about second, third order consequences and priorities a lot more than you used to 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago.
Yeah, I think that capital has been less of a problem recently in Brazil. I think maybe 5 years ago it was still a big question mark for, especially post-Series C. But as Mate said, today we have multiple tech companies at scale. So you're past that stage. It's definitely much easier to have access to capital. And maybe the cliche is people, right? And the challenges evolve over time. So I would say that back in, 2014, 15, getting software developers was harder, not because you were competing with other tech firms, but you were competing with either big banks or big corporations or other types of institutions. Today, it's about competing with other tech firms. Also, at scale, I think, as Mate said, there are big challenges in terms of management, and it's very, very hard to see companies in Brazil who have mastered the art of building a stable tech big team. I have not seen any at all that does that in a very good way. I remember when Nubank had about 100 software developers and no manager in between the founder and the developers. 100. Crazy. So even the big firms right now have a big challenge there. But in general, it's people. We can see this new wave of expansion. I think you guys are just opening an office outside of São Paulo, right? And there are other companies opening offices outside of São Paulo, even in Europe or here in the US. And it will just be, I think the challenge will increase over time. The next few years, it's going to get harder for you to tackle that issue.
I have a couple of questions from the audience. If you could answer quickly, sorry, because we don't have too much time. But the first is, how much influence or collaboration do you have with the public sector in regards to urban planning? Is there any opportunity to develop partnerships, as you know, what truly sells and could help the real estate economy to develop and grow?
So in our case, we have an advocacy arm, which is a company called DataZap, fully owned by Grupo Zap, and has a partnership with FIPE, the institute from the University of São Paulo. And over the years, we have developed a few relationships. So yes, we can work with city halls or even the federal government at multiple initiatives. The most recent one is we're working with the Ministry of Economy to help them sell their properties. So it's kind of a pro bono approach, and we are working with them to help them appraise their properties and sell. And there are multiple challenges because you cannot change the law. It's very hard, so you have to change a few things in the process. But yes, so I think that over the years, the public sector has been more open to tech and now it's clear that they recognize our ability to create a positive impact there.
Yeah, I think along the lines of public sector working with companies like Uber or 99 in improving infrastructure, improving urban mobility, there's a big opportunity for the PropTech sector to work with the public sector to improve urban planning, improve just the environment that we live in, which is a much more challenging, more vertical and denser environment, and again, an environment that lacks data. So I think that tech companies that gather a lot of data, that by definition have a lot of information, both on the consumer and on the asset level, it's a big opportunity, but I think it's also our duty, as Lucas said, to kind of give some of that back to the market. And again, it all kind of feeds back into the flywheel. If urban planning gets better, there's more GDP getting created, people have more money to spend on real estate, you increase transactions, you increase liquidity, and ultimately whoever sits in between consumers as an intermediary wins. The pie gets bigger.
One final question here, also from the audience. How do you see the new generation of real estate consumers behaving regarding use of real estate as a service or as a property?
Yeah, I think that real estate still today is an extremely static asset class. I think here in the US that has been changing recently, although consumers still tend to think very much in extremes, whether it's buy or sell, or whether it's buy or rent. And I think in Brazil, that's certainly also the case. I think Airbnb did an amazing job of breaking some of that discourse and showing that there is something in between a hotel stay and a long-term rental. I think that a lot of the usage pattern that we're seeing in Airbnb and in other companies that have done well in Brazil, mostly on the short-term rental side and rental side generally, is that consumers are looking for more flexible solutions. So I think it's a huge opportunity to build companies and build solutions, whether it's a consumer solution or whether it's a financial solution, fintech solution, to basically make this asset class a lot more dynamic, or make the uses of the asset class, whether it's on the residential or on the commercial side, make the uses a lot more dynamic. And I think that that the same way that stocks back in the day got traded relatively infrequently, and today are being traded in nanoseconds. It's all about speed. I think real estate more and more will move out of this static world and into a much more dynamic world. And I think we have to adapt to the uses and user needs there, which are evolving fast.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There is this trend towards the house as a service, right? Whatever that means, it encompasses lots, but we see consumers wanting more as a service of everything. In our case, of course, when we think of sale and rentals, we can see this trend clearly. And given that we have big audience, right? A few tens of millions every month come to our websites and platforms. So it's very easy for us to understand the trends of consumers migrating from properties that they were looking for purchase and now to rent. So since 2014, this is a stable trend of consumers migrating from buy to rent from a search perspective, right? And there's not much to add to what Mate said, but there is this tendency, and lots of industries around real estate can actually capture more value and create value and capture value from this trend. Yeah.
Okay, well, unfortunately the time is over, but thanks very much, Lucas and Mate. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you, Fábio.
Thanks for having us.